Welcome, 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 and one more welcome to everybody. Part of our continuing series where we talk to professors, reporters, columnists, writers, activists, people on the ground, anybody on the left, anybody on the right. We don't care as long as we can get full, thoughtful perspectives directly to you, the public, so that you could do this thing that was popular when I was in high school, not so popular as much anymore these days, and it's called thinking for yourself. Maybe we'll have a renaissance, maybe we won't. With us today is Professor Christopher Federico, and he is from the University of Minnesota, driven to discover. He works at the College of Liberal Arts. He's a collegiate affiliation. He's an expert in political science, psychology, and political psychology. Christopher M. Federico is a professor of political science and psychology and the Beverly and Frank Richard Fink Professor in Liberal Arts at the University of Minnesota. He currently serves as the director of the University of Minnesota's Center for the Study of Political Psychology and is a vice president of the International Society of Political Psychology. A political psychologist with interests that cross disciplinary boundaries, his research focuses in particular on the nature of ideology and belief systems, the psychological foundations of political preferences, and intergroup attitudes. Professor Federico is the author of numerous scholarly articles, Open versus Closed, about personality at the forefront of political psychology and the political psychology of democratic citizenship. He's also the recipient of numerous awards, including the 2007 International Society of Political Psychology Erik Erikson Award for Early Career Achievements, the 2007 International Society for Political Psychology Roberta Siegel Jr. Scholar Paper Award, and the and the 2018 International Society Political Psychology David O. Sears Book Award. He received his PhD in 2001 from the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, great school. Second. And he is the author of this study. But before we get into that, Professor, did I get anything wrong? Do we need to correct something? Did I say something incorrect?
The only thing that's incorrect there is I'm no longer a vice president of ISPP. But that is my fault because I failed to update that on my website.
No longer VP, but you are super experienced and well-versed in psychology, political psychology, and that's exactly what we want to talk about today. The first question I'd like to ask you, if I may, why did you write this chapter, and why did you write it at that time? Obviously, I have an inkling, but for the lay public watching this, and if you could answer not just as an academic, but also as an American with, as I say, two working eyeballs, what's going on at this time? Why was this an important topic? Why did you think this was worthy of study and at this particular time?
Well, I mean, the not so interesting answer is I was asked to write the chapter volume, and
Fair.
I was perceived rightly or wrongly as a person who kind of worked at the interface of personality differences on one hand and how those relate to political differences in the broader public. In terms of how I decided to approach the topic, which was more under my control, I've kind of, for a long time in my career, been trying to bridge two lines of inquiry in the social sciences and in political discourse more generally. One set of ideas turns on this question of, well, what makes people identify as the left or the right, or whatever differing positions are available to choose from politically in the society that one lives in. The other question is, well, what exacerbates the big political differences that we observe at a higher level? Obviously, personality differences and political differences are not the same thing, but one thing that we know on one side from a lot of research in psychology in particular is that there are reliable differences, at least in countries like the United States, Western Europe, and any number of other places, between people who identify with the left and people who identify with the right, as those are presently defined in many societies. The way that this is often summarized is that individuals with strong needs for security and certainty tend to identify with people right because the status quo is more of a safe space, so to speak. Whereas people who have weaker needs for certainty and security, they're more likely to identify with the left. That's a common finding, but the question I was interested in asking was, well, do these differences that we observe between people in personality and how much they desire certainty and security versus something else, when do those make a difference in terms of people's political convictions? Do they always make a difference in terms of people's political convictions? Individual differences in rigidity, needs for certainty and security, whatever you want to call it, those are sort of deep features in many respects of how we think about the world, how our brains are built. And for whatever reason, the processes that led up to the evolution of human populations left us with big differences among people in those things. But those differences exist all over the world and through all segments of humanity. And they've existed for a long time prior to when politics started to look the way they do right at this moment, which in the United States is, of course, quite polarized, using polarization in a number of ways. So the question I was asking is, well, when do we observe political differences as a function of personality differences? And so that was my interest here. And really, the big point that I try to make is that for all of the insistence that people, not just academics, but folks elsewhere, have that people on the left and people on the right are fundamentally different from one another, that is not always the case. For personality differences to kind of register in the form of different political beliefs, people actually have to care about politics. They have to pay a lot of attention to what political groups have to say. And they have to absorb those kind of packages of beliefs that society offers. Otherwise, they're not going to necessarily adopt views that are different depending on what their personality is. So I think part of what I wanted to emphasize here again is that, just because we see personality differences among people, those are not fated to always manifest themselves as very differences of the sort we see today. Even in my lifetime, I was born in 1972. We haven't seen the same amount of polarization among individuals in society that we necessarily see today. But there were certainly individual differences in needs for certainty and security back when I was born in 1972. So how do we explain that? And basically, I think it's an interplay between real differences between individuals and personality and what people's political environments are throwing at them in terms of different choices, information, and what have you.
Can we say that there's generalities? I mean, obviously, yes, you know, if there's a personality type that's more Republican, a personality type that's more Democrat, you can't say just because you have a desire for more security, you 100% must be a Republican. They could be a Democrat too. But would it be fair to say there's generalities? I've seen a lot of research that seems to suggest, in general, Republicans like security, safety, they're afraid of loss, whereas liberals seem to be more open to equality as the driving force, openness to society, and new experiences in general. Is that fair to say there's generalities?
Those are the sort of general findings. So one way that political psychologists tend to characterize the difference between the left and the right is on the right, there is more of a preference for keeping things the way they are and a greater acceptance of hierarchical social relations, whereas on the left, there's a greater openness to change and a greater preference for equality. Now, one very important part of that definition is that there's this assumption that wanting equality, for example, always goes with openness to change, to new and different things, to things that are ambiguous, unclear, complex, or what have you. And that is kind of the standard understanding of things. And actually, if you look at how political preferences sort out in many places in the world, so for example, the English-speaking countries, Western Europe in particular, that is in fact how things hang together. So, for example, people who prefer greater economic equality, they're also more open to social change. They're more socially liberal. They're perhaps more secular in religious terms, and what have you. But the thing is that that is, in some ways, very much a product of how the history of those nations and how the leaders of those countries over many, many decades and even centuries have kind of constructed different packages of beliefs. So our traditional, the whole terminology of left versus right, of course,
Right.
goes back to the French National Assembly around the time of the French Revolution. And much of our kind of shorthand for that is really sort of derived from that. And that reflects a period of time where those who wanted change also wanted much more equality than existed under prior arrangements. But the question stands, are those things always kind of aligned like that? Is there always that traditional left-right alignment? And there is increasingly a certain amount of evidence that when you look at things globally, when you look outside, say, the Western political world, outside the English-speaking world, those two dimensions of beliefs, wanting more versus less equality and being more versus less culturally open and open to change, those things do not necessarily hang together. In many respects, they're what we would call orthogonal. They're not correlated with one another. So you actually find a great number of people out there in the broader world who will tell you they want much more economic equality than we currently have. They want the government to reduce economic differences among people, and they want the government to engage in a lot of redistribution. But by the same token, they'll turn around and tell you things or express beliefs that are very much what we would think of as socially conservative. They want tighter regulation of sexual behavior. They're perhaps not so open to different cultures or to immigration or something like that. So while this kind of standard understanding of the difference between left and right, it's real and it's very meaningful in a certain part of the world with a certain history, it's not universally meaningful.
Okay.
And for that reason, once we get outside the Western world, we don't always see that same set of relationships between underlying personality traits on one hand and the political beliefs people choose. And that's particularly the case when we start to talk about things like how society should be organized in economic terms, whether there should be more versus less economic equality, and whether there should be greater redistribution or less redistribution.
In many other countries, they have like 3 or 4 parties, and we have 2.
Yes.
So we're kind of like designed to have this binary, I win, you lose. And as I have a lot of conversations with professors, the type of democracy that we have is the minority. It's not popular. Most of the world democracies have a parliamentary system with multi-parties, and they have to form coalitions to form government. And the big tell for me is that when America set up democracies in Iraq and Afghanistan, we set them up on the European model, not on the American model. Basically, nobody does the way that we do now because they view it as madness. They view it as forcing us to constantly fight with each other instead of coming to a coalition. I remember the Japanese had some phrase, basically, it was the American winner take all style of democracy, I think is the phrase they have. So I won, you lost, tough, you get nothing, I get everything I want, deal with it. I think as Obama said even, and he was the good president, elections have consequences and I won. So, I mean, even the best participate in the system. If I may, I want to read the bio or the background on this and ask you another question on the study. Top-down and bottom-up perspectives on political polarization have unfolded on largely parallel tracks without speaking too extensively to one another. In part, this is due to their roots in different disciplines. The top-down perspective has its origins in political science, whereas the bottom-up perspective comes out of personality and social psychology. Though accounts of polarization offered by political scientists and psychologists are sometimes presented as antagonistic in their implications, they need not be. In this chapter, I review research aimed at integrating the top-down and bottom-up accounts of political differences in mass publics in an effort to develop a hybrid perspective on the basis of political polarization. Like the bottom-up psychological approach, the model I present argues that people are systematically attracted to different positions on the basis of individual differences. in the needs for security and certainty. However, like the top-down approach, it also contends that the tendency for those with different psychological dispositions to adopt polarized political preferences depends on exposure to elite political signals that provide information about the content and meaning of different ideological, partisan, and issue orientations. How much is political polarization? And this is another debate I see constantly with academics. Oh, it's just the elites that are polarized. The people aren't polarized. Or maybe the people are polarized, but it's really just because they're signaled by the elites to be polarized. And then there's another theory. The people themselves are polarized and the elites are reacting to that. Which one seems to make more sense to you? Are the people polarized themselves? Are they polarized only to the extent of signals they get from the elites? Or are the elites actually responding to the people on the ground?
Well, it's a combination of all those things. You have to kind of think about it as two sets of factors. One is what differences among individuals in a population are there? And these might be differences in, say, personality, psychological tendencies, or what have you. But they could also be things as simple as, what racial or ethnic group do you belong to, how religious versus secular you are. These are all potentially latent differences among people in the broader society. And those are all potentially ways of aligning conflict or producing conflict. But the dominant view in political science, which I agree with up to a point, is that whether or not those sort of latent differences become real differences that produce what we think of as polarization really depends on how political leaders or political elites organize those differences. What conflicts do they make salient? To what extent do they try to extend conflict? Because in many respects, to use sort of a classic metaphor that goes back to the political scientist E.E. Schneider, you can think of politics as a fight on a sidewalk, in a sense. There's a limited number of people who are actually throwing the fists at each other, but usually a crowd of gawkers around there. But one thing you can think about is how might that conflict be extended to the people watching? And politics is often about the extent to which leaders or ringleaders, if you want to use that terminology, are able to make certain conflicts that only matter to a smaller group of people matter to larger segments of the population. So on one hand, the conflicts we see aren't random in the sense that they're completely made up or completely artificial, are completely based on meaningless distinctions among people. Personality distinctions between those who want more certainty and security versus those who are less, those are very real. They influence how people act in their everyday lives. By the same token, racial differences in the United States, and in particular, differences in access to power and resources as a function of historical racial stratification, those matter as well. So does religion. There's sort of a real underlying logic to why the conflicts look the way they do. But they have to be activated in some sense. And a big role in doing that activation is, in fact, leaders. Do leaders depict their opponents as being extremely alien or threatening? Do leaders take very starkly different positions on a wider range of issues? Do they take different positions on the issues that end up having the greatest emotional resonance to people? So, there are many examples that you can give of that. I think one that's kind of meaningful in the American context is that what we think of as the age of polarization or the present age of polarization doesn't go back that far. It really goes back in earnest only to the 1990s, as that's when social scientists started talking a lot about it. You can take it back even earlier to conflicts that started to become more apparent in the 70s and 80s and even the late 60s. But before that, in the immediate wake of World War II, you have the America of the 50s and 60s as kind of being depicted as sort of a very quiescent era, an era where, people kind of got along. And indeed, the parties were very different then. And one way the parties were less different is that they were less ideologically sorted. So you had a lot of conservative Democrats and liberal or moderate Republicans. But another part of that is simply, well, what different issue domains were the parties sorted on or had very different views on? Even after World War II, during that fairly quiet period, the Democrats and the Republicans, on average, took fairly different views on the role of the government in the economy, the balance of power between capital and labor, and things like that. That is the classic New Deal distinction, as we call it. That still exists between the parties. But the big thing that kind of unfolded over the period of time that we tend to think America polarized during is that there are all kinds of other issue conflicts in other domains that got layered on top of that basic distinction about economics. Some of this is stuff that we think of as disputes over morality, religion, social liberalism versus social conservatism. Those are, of course, a big part of what differentiates the left from the right, and now Democrats from Republicans. But another part of it is also conflict over racial inequality in the United States. Prior to the Civil Rights Revolution in the 1960s, the parties were harder to tell apart on matters of race. The Democratic Party, of course, had a very large Southern segregationist wing, and there were mixed views in the Republican Party. After the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act, of 1965, you really saw the parties start to sort at the national level, at least, among leaders. And that, of course, kind of led to some sorting, further down the line in the general population. But the key point I'm trying to make is that if we want to understand why polarization looks worse or feels worse than it used to, it's because more different conflicts over different issues between different types of people, between different groups, all align with one another now, and they all align with partisanship. And that is really kind of a big part of what's going on. Now, the question is, how did that happen? All of those differences among people, whether they be personality, group identity, or what have you, those all existed for a long time, and they have for many, many years. But how does that get linked up with the difference between Democrats and Republicans, or more generally what we think of as the difference between left and right? I would argue that although all those bottom-up factors are very important in determining the content of conflict, you have to have leaders who organize conflict and throw out different options between political choices in a way that kind of brings it all together and allows polarization to unfold. So, I think it's definitely not the case that all these differences are arbitrary. The real underlying differences in mass publics between people that potentially lead to conflict, but whether or not we get something that looks the way it does now really depends a lot on the work of elites.
Okay. Well, let me, I want to follow up on that, but I want to ask one pushback question very gently. And I don't do gotcha journalism, so it's coming. I'll let you know it's coming. It's coming. Some people said that if you go back to when Barack Obama was president, you had the Miss America pageant, and it happened twice. One Miss America pageant was a girl whose parents were from Lebanon. She was an American girl, either born here or raised here, talk like an American girl, walk like an American girl. And when she won the Miss America pageant, and this is Barack Obama's president in a post-racial society, we're all coming together, there was so much hate against her that NBC and CBS had to do news stories on the amount of backlash from regular Americans. And it was basically like, you're not an American. Why don't you put a cloth on your head and go back to the Middle East? Fast forward 2 or 3 more years, we have another Miss America. Her parents are from India. Same story. She was either born here or raised here earlier. Same thing. The media has to cover stories about massive rejection of regular Americans against this girl. Same thing. Put a cloth on your head, get back to the Middle East. We don't want no Muslims representing us. Trump wasn't a factor. Trump didn't make that happen. That was just the public. Later on then, during Obama's time, we have the Tea Party. Tea Party came out of nowhere, kind of caught the Republican or the elites off guard. Regular people who were citizens rose to elite positions. Some people say that Donald Trump came about because he saw that the racism there, he saw that you could be an obstructionist and get forward. That would seem to suggest that the people themselves were doing it and the elites took signals from them. Wrong?
That is not entirely wrong. Again, there are two things going on here. There are latent differences that exist out there in the population, things that can potentially be turned into the basis for more far-ranging political conflicts. So to use the example of race and racial attitudes and ethnic attitudes, there is great variation in those attitudes, and there's, of course, a great well of ethnocentrism, ethno-nationalism, racial resentment, all these different things that exist out there in the population. Those variation in those attitudes, and particularly attitudes more on the prejudice end of each of those spectrums, they can be exploited. The question is, do they get exploited? And to what extent do political leaders frame the choices in ways that make those differences that have kind of always been there to varying extents more relevant to any immediate political choice? So to give you one example of this, racism was nothing new when the Tea Party came around or when Donald Trump came around. Those differences had always existed in the population to some extent. But the thing is, what do people decide to cast their votes on? So thinking just about, white Americans for a second, okay, there are large differences among white Americans in attitudes toward race. One question is the extent to which different groups of white folks are using those differences in racial attitudes to make their political choices. We can choose whether to vote for the Democrats and Republicans depending on a variety of issues or a variety of things that we see the parties are different about. Again, sort of coming out of World War II and out of the New Deal period, the classic distinction, the classic group distinction with rich versus poor, capital versus labor. And there are a lot of ancestral political loyalties or partisan loyalties that are built on that. That has undergone a lot of flux since the 1960s. But bringing it more to the future, one very interesting thing that was observed by a political scientist named Michael Tesler, who was also a student of David Sears, who you mentioned in my bio. I studied under Sears a bit too. There was a lot of sorting among white Americans during the Obama administration. So, up to about 2008, there were a surprisingly large number of white Americans who held very racially resentful attitudes, fairly negative attitudes toward African Americans, fairly unsympathetic attitudes toward African Americans who continued to vote Democratic. And they voted Democratic because they were emphasizing other things in the political places.
I said that, yeah, and people were like, "No, it's a new day," and I go, "No, it is not." These people have no.
So one thing that happens over the course of the Obama administration, from Tesler's perspective, is that the fact that you have a black man as a leader of one of the parties and as president kind of makes the difference between the parties on matters of race more obvious, even if people don't live and breathe and die politics on a day-to-day basis the way people on political Twitter do. It became a very obvious difference between the parties. And as Tesler argued, that led more white Americans to kind of make choices or different choices than they used to on the basis of race. Tesler's argument was that, to use the language of political psychology, Obama was a chronic race prime. By prime, we mean activate people's interest in some topic and make that topic more central to why they choose to vote for this party or that party. And so that's part of the argument, about how things changed. And that's a very recent change. And I guess the broader point I'm trying to make is that you can have certain kinds of attitudes out there, or personality traits, or other individual level differences that could potentially seed conflict or lead people to change their political loyalties, but they're not necessarily going to do so unless there is some signal that comes from outside. Quite often, that is a signal given by elites or leaders about some new difference between the parties or between competing political factions that people didn't know before. Sometimes it can also come in the form of an acute societal level crisis, or a bunch of different things. But an important point I would make is that while all of these differences among individuals out in the general population, differences in needs for certainty and security, differences in racial attitudes, differences in levels of religiosity, all those things can potentially matter, but how much they matter for political choices in any given time and place depends on how those political choices are framed.
So the people can be polarized on their own, but it takes a leader to come along and figure out how to shape that or frame that or weaponize it or turn that into something to increase the polarization.
Yes, to a large extent. And again, I want to emphasize that all these statements I'm making are all other things being equal type statements.
Of course. Let me just say real quick, thank you for being willing to talk about experimental ideas and theoretical stuff. I understand with a lot of professors, you very much like the research doesn't say that. I can't, but we got to have more of a general conversation for the public to get it. So I really appreciate you being willing to step outside the box mentally a little bit. How do the elites signal to the masses to be polarized? Just for the lay public watching, I have some ideas, but could you give some Democrat examples and some Republican examples? I mean, how do they say, hey guys, let's be nobody actually comes out and says, let's be polarized, right? It's things they do. It's kind of dog whistling or acts. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, it's a variety of different things. The classic view in political science, for example, pertains to something that we might call elite opinion leadership. Loyalties in the general public change when people in the general public see that leaders from the Democratic Party and leaders from the Republican Party are offering somewhat different choices than they used to. And there are two kind of classic examples of this in 20th century American politics. One is the immediate New Deal period. There was an acute social crisis in the form of the Great Depression and the market crash. And starting in 1932, but leading up to it from 1929, Herbert Hoover and Franklin Roosevelt offered very different visions of how much the government should do to address the risks inherent in the market economy and to deal with the immediate crisis that was the Great Depression. That was a difference that was between the Republicans and Democrats that was somewhat more fudged before that. But that was a very clarifying election. The other example, and the more recent one, and the one that we kind of live even more in the shadow of, is the 1964 election. And right before the 1964 election, you of course have the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And though it's true that the Democrats and Republicans at the state and local level had already started to kind of shift in their views on civil rights, with the Democrats becoming more open to civil rights and the Republicans becoming a little less open to quote unquote federal interference, it really became crystallized at the national level in 1964. And the choice in the 1964 election between LBJ, who strongly championed the Civil Rights Act, and Barry Goldwater, who questioned the role of the federal government in guaranteeing civil rights, and in many respects tried to appeal to disgruntled Southerners, white Southerners who had never voted Republican in a long time or ever. That was a very clarifying difference, or a very clarifying new difference at the national level. And again, when we see these different new differences emerge, that really kind of is one factor that's provides a strong signal or elite signal to the public that might lead to polarization. Now, that's not the only thing, of course. There's also all kinds of issues of tone, of implied norms about what kinds of things are acceptable in the midst of political conflict, and so on and so forth. So starting in the 1990s, you do have the emergence of new forms of partisan media. So Fox News, then later on MSNBC, and then after that, you have the emergence of social media and all it brings with that. With all of those changes, you see a lot more media content that's very much just focused on those people over there are doing something that is very bad for America. These people aren't great Americans, and blah, blah, blah. And those are strong emotional signals. They lead to, or they help promote what political scientists call affective polarization, just sort of a general dislike of the out party. And another thing that kind of comes along with those new media developments and the sort of increased emotional tendency of partisan conflict in the 1990s and thereafter is what we might call social sorting, or what the political scientist Lily Mason calls social sorting, which is we start to see that Democrats and Republicans aren't just different in the sense of being members of different parties. They are also members of ideological groups, religious groups, racial groups, and so on and so forth. So it increases this perception of the parties exactly being consisting of very different coalitions. So once you start to see, or once people in the general public start to see at the elite level, all of these different signals about who the other guys are and who we are, what the differences between the teams are, that in addition to just signaling issue differences, that can make a big difference in the extent to which people look at the choices they have and say, well, I'm going to choose this on the basis of what my characteristics are, or choose that.
So that sounds like you're referencing The Big Sort. I think the author's name was Bill Bishop, and he said roughly since the early 1990s, it appears that Americans have been ideologically sorting themselves out into hardcore Republican and hardcore Democrat counties. I think the big metric he uses is landslide election counties, where one party wins over the other by 20 points, and that basically we don't have competitive counties anymore. He's saying that goes back to the 1990s. Do you buy the theory that Americans have ideologically sorted themselves out? Maybe they've moved, maybe they haven't moved, but we're getting to where we have, we always vote Republican here all the time, always. We don't even entertain another candidate, and that more of America seems to be going that way than the heydays of the 1950s to 80s, where you were more open to both sides. Does that seem like a reasonable theory to you?
The evidence is actually somewhat equivocal on that.
Okay.
You kind of see some of these differences, things like, increased differences, for example, between rural counties and urban counties, and the extent to which they're overwhelmingly Democratic in their presidential voting or overwhelmingly Republican. But the question is, are people actually getting up and moving from one place to the other because of politics? Is someone saying, I can't live I'm too liberal to live in the Georgia suburbs, I have to go to New York City? And the evidence about that is somewhat limited. There isn't a lot of evidence that people are actually directly and observably motivated by politics, and politics above all,
Right.
in their decisions about where to live. Now, this whole thing about the big sort in the geographic sense, that is sort of an extreme example. People can self-segregate in numerous other ways. The big worry among social scientists and commentators is, do people kind of put themselves in information silos, filter bubbles, or what have you? That is, taking social media as an example. Do people kind of sort themselves into environments where they follow only people who agree with them and hear from only people they agree with them? Do they get information only from congenial outlets, and so on and so forth? And actually, the research on the extent to which people have done that, and the extent to which a lot of people really live like that, is again very equivocal. So we think of Twitter as a real menace in the world of polarization, but in reality, most people are not on Twitter, And even among those who are on Twitter, the vast majority of people, they spend most of their time tweeting about entertainment or sports, not about politics. Political Twitter is a very, very self-selected group of people who may have come to it with strong interests in politics to begin with. There's a lot of other evidence like this as well. So, there's a lot of worry. There's, everyone watching either Fox News or perhaps MSNBC now. And the evidence is that most people have a fairly mixed media diet. And beyond that, there are a lot of people who simply don't pay attention to political news, period. They would rather look at something else when they turn on the TV. Last but not least, we often find that polarization has increased the most among elements of the population or sectors of the population that have been least ensconced in heavy social media use.
Thank you.
So while we can't rule out stuff like sorting into social media silos or filter bubbles out completely as a source of polarization, the actual evidence we have suggests that its role is somewhat limited.
So, we're talking about, I'd heard that about the elderly, that there was some evidence saying the elderly are very polarized, but they're not on Twitter. They're not super tech. So you're going to go, it's these apps made them polarized. Can't explain that for this group.
It's a factor, but it's often given, I think, exaggerated, emphasis.
I'd heard about the big sort, and I'd heard, it's hard to prove that people are saying, I must move to where other people vote the way I do. I've heard another theory that seems to make sense to me. You have a general sense of culture and values, and you just don't fit in the community. And then you see videos of another community, and you feel like those values and that culture seems to fit me more. And so you move for a lifestyle change. And then when you're there, although you don't have conscious conversations with the neighbors, you pick up cues that begin to suggest a way to vote. Let me ask you about elite signals. And specifically, I want to drill down. Some people are saying Donald Trump says, boy, I like to punch that guy at my rally. Or if you see someone let's punch someone at my rally. Or we had the violent event in the deep South in South Carolina, I think. And he comes out and he says, good people on both sides. People say that sort of dog whistles and suggests violence and hate towards the other side. And that's why we got so much polarization, is that Trump is giving these very conscious elite signals. He's not the only one. He has many accolades and supporters too, who are also elites. Is that what you mean by, or is that at least an example of elite signaling to the masses?
That is one example. So again, one big thing is simply leaders or elites taking very different issue positions that they might not have in the past, and those differences in issue positions becoming visible. But another thing is, what we might call cues about how much should you dislike group X, and how acceptable is it to engage in extreme forms of political hatred, political animus, and what have you. And their leaders are norm setters. They do have an effect on what people out in the general public see as acceptable. And, the major concern with Donald Trump is that far more than, just about any other major political leader, let alone presidential candidate we've seen in our lifetimes, he was willing to kind of buck the consensus about what is considered proper and about how far you can go in, saying, well, my opponent should be beaten up, the FBI should be unleashed, or the DOJ should be unleashed on my opponents. So there's been that constant worry. And, more empirically, in terms of the research that's done on this, there is evidence, fairly recent evidence, that you can run experiments where people, you'll get a representative sample of the population, and you'll randomly assign people to either get information that says that Democrats and Republicans agree that we have to respect certain norms of democracy, civility, and what have you, or that they reject those things. And those, whether or not people are assigned to that it makes an observable difference in the extent to which people show what we call affective polarization, and the extent to which they see victory by their opponents as legitimate and kind of respect democratic outcomes. So there is some pretty good social science evidence that, the norms that elites set regarding what types of conflict and what types of expressions of hostility are acceptable, that those can make a difference. And, I would say that, above and beyond the simple fact that leaders of different parties take very different positions on issues, that this is a factor. Leaders have an important role in kind of containing conflict or establishing norms about what types of conflict or expressions of conflict are acceptable. So in that sense, it's not just Trump, but a variety of leaders who kind of engage in counter-normative statements about what sort of actions are acceptable. So, I think things matter along the lines that you're suggesting.
So when Joseph Biden is asked about Trump and he goes, I'd like to punch him in the face live on TV, that also is an elite signaling and not in a good way.
Technically, anything like that is, an elite signal. Again, you have to kind of, take an overall look at, the differences among the parties and the extent to which you see signals like that, Biden notwithstanding. And you do see, to be completely honest, a good bit of evidence that that sort of rhetoric is more concentrated on the populist right, the Trump type right now, than in other segments of the population.
Absolutely. But what I've noticed is when I'm talking to some professors, it does seem like it's more on the right, but I almost see like people are completely unaware that any of it happens on the left. So when I brought up to professors, Joe Biden said on TV, I want to punch Trump in the face. Many of them had never heard that before. And when I brought up that Kamala Harris went on the Ellen DeGeneres show and joked about shooting Donald Trump in the head, most of them had never heard that before. And when I talked about how Chris Cuomo was on CNN and said it's okay to deal with political differences by punching someone in the face, most of them had never heard that before. And I go, how fair is it to say it's all on Trump's side when a lot of people aren't aware of many examples on the left? That's neither here nor there. It's just noticed. I want to ask you about, can they designalize? So elite signal, we're hyperpolarized. Let's go with Bill Bishop's idea. We've been at it since 1992. We've been doing this for 3 decades. Can we fix this? Can we depolarize? And is the way out of it elites counter signaling? They signaled one way. Can elites just signal the other way and everybody goes, I will do what you say, maybe subconsciously, and within a generation we get fixed? Is that possible?
Well, in theory it is. Elite changes in elite opinion leadership can make a big difference. We have a lot of evidence of that, historical, survey-based, and even experimental. But the question then becomes is, well, what makes elites more or less willing and able to kind of shift gears? Now, the difficult part of this is that, first of all, not all elites are in agreement with one another. So just taking, the conservative coalition as an example of this, in many respects, you can argue that Republican politicians and people who work in government, they have a different set of incentives than, say, people who work at Fox News. People who work at Fox News, the business model is built around intensifying conflict, which increases viewership. And in many respects, different, sort of right-wing outlets are competing with one another to kind of win the outrage contest, so to speak. And that's all well and good from their, the standpoint of their business model, but it's not great for democracy. And, an underappreciated part of it is it's also difficult for people who work in government. Not all of them. Some of them are just bomb throwers themselves, but, in the metaphorical sense.
Right.
But, there are others who are trying to get things done or have to get things done. And when there are those different incentive structures, even among elites who are technically on the same team, that can cause problems. But the other part of it is, it involves a process of change. Essentially, if we're in a equilibrium, so to speak, where the thing that people have an incentive to do is to intensify conflict and to make conflict more salient, how do you get people to break out of that set? Leaders obviously do it because they think that that is what's going to work best for them. One part of that dynamic is simply, primary elections. Am I going to lose to someone who's going to stoke outrage more deeply than I do? Technically, I would say that if you could, wave a magic wand and get elites to give less polarized signals, that would make a big, big difference. But the question is, can they do that? Are they willing to do that? And that's where we start to get, into, deeper questions of social organization and perhaps conflicts that we can't erase, but that we might want to find a better way of managing.
That's the question. I'm sorry. You're getting at what I wanted. If you use the phrase I wanted to ask you, if you had a magic wand and you could go poof, AOC and Donald Trump giving each other hugs and saying, I was wrong and we need to come together. And I see you as a fellow human. And if you win the race, I accept it. And if you win the race, I accept it. Let's say you magically got the top 30, 40, 50 people in politics, the most polarizing, and you got them all to start hanging out with their exact opposite and talking like that. In this magic world, how quickly do 200 million people snap back into where they were before 1990?
Well, it wouldn't be overnight. This would have to kind of be a repeated game, as we would call it. This would have to be happen a lot. It would have to happen on, for an extended period of time. We're talking about things that could take years and years and maybe even, periods of time on the level of decades to undo. These things, don't change overnight. I mean, sometimes we think about some of the changes I was talking about earlier with the civil rights revolution and the realignment that produced between the parties as kind of being day and night, but it wasn't. It wasn't really until the late 1980s that change was fully solidified. So again, it's something that, in terms of polarization as we see it in the aggregate, it's going to take a long time for things to sort out. Now, the other part of this, I think, is, what kinds of things do we want to depolarize more than others?
Right.
So there are always going to be differences in ideology and differences between parties. That is
some polarization's good. Some.
Yeah. Now, the whole genius of democracy is that it kind of puts a limit on conflict, so to speak. It subjects conflicts between classes, between other social groups, to kind of a regular process that keeps things from turning into violence or continuous wrecking of institutions. So, obviously we don't want a situation where everything is kumbaya all the time. We want real differences and real choices between parties. But, the question is, what differences are good and what differences are bad? And beyond that, how can we set up our institutions so that more people can make choices that accord with, what they want in ways that don't lead to, high levels of hatred, breakdowns in the constitutional order potentially, and what have you. So one thing you'd mentioned earlier that I think is a very important point in all of this. So we can talk endlessly about different sorts of micro interventions that might, make people more or less polarized. And I don't want to dismiss those. Those are important things. Among other things, it's very important to correct people's misconceptions about what their opponents believe of them. It's important to correct people's misconceptions about how far apart the parties really are. There's a lot of exaggeration of those things, and that can make a difference. But those kinds of things, as important as they are only get you so far. And one thing you mentioned earlier that I think is kind of important in that regard is two features of our system. One is that we have a strong presidency rather than a parliamentary system, and also that we have first past the post
Right. Winner
elections
take all.
with no element of proportional representation. And as you noted, when we have had to set up governments in other parts of the world after World War II, after Iraq, we didn't go with our system, so to speak. Most political scientists hate strong presidential systems for good reasons. They are often observed to go along with more frequent breakdowns in the democratic order. For a long time, the United States was seen as being a big outlier in this regard. So, having a strong presidency like that can really, that's a problematic factor. Now, I don't know how you get from having a strong presidential system in the United States to having something else, but there is some suggestion that's one of those channeling factors. Something that's perhaps more amenable to change, and there are some political scientists who talk a lot about this. Lee Drutman is one of them. You may be familiar with him. Is how do we do elections in, say, the House of Representatives? Again, those are all first past the post elections. Whichever candidate gets the most votes, is the one that wins, and that kind of forces people into this equilibrium where you have only two political choices. That is a well-known regularity in how democracies work. We call it Duverger's law. And how do you get around that? How do you offer people more political choices?
What was the term? I'm sorry to interrupt. What was the term?
Duverger's law. There was a French political scientist named Maurice Duverger.
Okay.
Duverger. And that was the principle that he observed, which is that, if you have first past the post elections where, even just the biggest plurality wins, it kind of creates this equilibrium where there are only going to be two political choices. Because people will think that voting for one or the other of the two major choices is simply going to be throwing away their vote. There are ways to get around that in terms of how you organize elections. You can have multi-member districts. You can have proportional representation where there's some element of the mechanism that seats legislators that make sure that the percentage of people who vote for party X, that's how it looks when the legislature is seated. You can also have things like ranked choice voting or single transferable vote, where people can rank candidates and do so in a way where, basically they're able to express a further, wider range of their actual preferences. There are many findings in the political science literature that suggest that there are lower levels of polarization in countries that don't have strong presidencies, that do have more of an element of proportional representation and what have you. So those are, things that are out there. We can't do away with conflict. We certainly can't do away with it, using micro level interventions, however useful those may be around the edges. But we can find different ways of channeling and managing conflict, and that is what, politics is about. As the last thing I would note is we have to think carefully about, in a normative sense, about what we wish for when we look back nostalgically at a less polarized period of American history.
Thank you.
Yeah. So if you look at the broad sweep of American history, first of all, the era of depolarization, or good feelings, as we might want to call it, was very short-lived. It really kind of stretched from a period in the early 20th century up through maybe the late 1970s. And that is not a long sweep of time. If you look, for example, at congressional voting and differences among the parties at the elite level, for most of American history outside that narrow period, polarization is endemic. It's a big thing. People beat each other up in Congress in the lead up to the Civil War. And of course, then we had a Civil War. So, first of all, polarization is more the norm than the exception. But the other thing is, if you think about that era of depolarization, particularly when it reached its height in the immediate post-war period, what did that rest on? In many respects, what undid it in the minds of most political scientists is racial equality became a national issue. And the government finally took action to ensure that we had a multiracial democracy, or an effective multiracial democracy. Well, that's something that Americans have continuously disagreed on. And once there was an end to kind of like this bipartisan consensus that the racial caste system in America would not be challenged by the federal government, that led to a lot of conflict. Conflict, all other things being equal, is bad. But if the price of suppressing conflict is to not have a multiracial democracy, or to sacrifice the human rights of a certain percentage of the population, that's not a good choice. So we have to kind of think carefully about, our nostalgia here about this, because in many respects, the fact that we have more polarization now, it's not good, all other things being equal, but in some ways, not all things are equal. In many respects, you could think of us as being in a period of adjustment. We are still, after many, many years, adjusting to being a multiracial democracy. And many of the conflicts that we associate with polarization, many of the conflicts that have really come to the fore during the Trump era and thereafter, a lot of it goes back to conflicts about, what kind of nation it should be. And in many respects, the fact that we have polarization, sorting, or whatever you call it, is the fact that conflict is now in the open rather than being kind of buried or subterranean in a sense.
I could see that. I remember when Obama was president and everybody saying, "Oh, America's not racist anymore," and I go, "I have relatives in Texas. I know that's not true." So and then what did we see? We went right back to it afterwards. So. One of the last questions I wanted to ask you was a psychological one. I live in the Central Valley. We have a lot of veterans here. And after the Iraq War happened, we got a new bunch of veterans. And my dad was in the Army during Vietnam, although he didn't go there. And I remember him coming home one day, or I talked to him, and he goes, "Oh, the new batch is in." Because he likes to go to the VA, the Veterans Hospital. And I go, "What do you mean the new batch?" And he goes, "The Iraq War veterans with a 1,000-yard stare. Last time I saw that was Vietnam." And he's talking about how there's these guys and they physically came back, but this stayed over there. They never actually came back. You can see it a lot. He remembered the guys in Vietnam. He had to wait 30, 40 more years. And then he immediately recognized it on 20-year-olds. And he goes, "I haven't seen that face in about 4 decades, but it's here now." There is a concept where people can go to such an extreme for so long that they're permanently traumatized. They don't come back.
Yeah.
The story with non-vets is ubiquitous. How do we know that the American people haven't experienced the level of trauma where they're like a vet from combat and they can't actually come back? I mean, how much trauma can you inject into a society? So much polarization, so much hate, doubting elections, January 6th, the coup on the Capitol, a president saying 78 million Americans are basically enemies of the state. Is there some level where we've traumatized ourselves too much that you're like a war vet? You don't actually come back.
Well, I guess I do think there is an increasing level of discomfort with and disdain for politics and just kind of disgust with it in many respects. I don't think we're at the point where the kinds of conflicts we observe, at least for the vast majority of the population, reach the level of trauma. On the other hand, if you look at what's going on in Ukraine right now, there's trauma for a huge portion of the population there. I don't think we're anywhere near that here. What we are at is kind of a point at which, for a large number of people, the entire idea of politics seems to be very unpleasant and something that people want to avoid. So one of my colleagues here at Minnesota in the Department of Mass Communication, he studies news avoidance. What are the characteristics of people who do not want to pay attention to political news and who explicitly avoid it? And one thing that we see there, and another research by, a variety of people, is that the average person doesn't like conflict too much. all of the things that we kind of lump into the bucket of polarization for a large percentage of the population, that's not how they want to spend their time. They don't want to spend their time paying attention to that. And you can make different normative judgments about that, but I mean, it's not surprising. All other things being equal, most people do not like to be subject to that stuff. And what you find in particular is that people who pay less attention to politics on a long-term basis, and in many cases, people whose views are more moderate or more mixed across different issues, with where say people take left-wing positions on some issues and right-wing ones on the other. Those are the folks who really tend to find the sort of conflict that we associate with polarization to be aversive, and it can cause them in turn to want to withdraw from politics, political discussion, and what have you even more. And this can have some very interesting consequences. And one such consequence, interestingly enough, is for how much polarization we actually observe out there.
Right.
So as it turns out, one of the key ways of measuring affective polarization, as we call it, to what extent do you dislike the political outgroup, is, you just ask people to indicate how warmly or coldly or positively or negatively they feel about the Democrats, how they feel about the Republicans. There's an increasing amount of evidence from people that I think you've talked to, like Jamie Druckman, that suggests that when people answer that question, they're not thinking about everyday people, the guy from down the street who votes Democratic or votes Republican. They are thinking about the major exemplars in national politics. So national level political figures associated with either the parties, your Trumps, your Bidens, and what have you. People's views of leaders are more polarized than their views of everyday partisans out in the world. And so if you kind of constrain people or instruct people to think separately about political leaders versus just everyday partisans, when they're thinking about just the guy down the street who happens to be a member of the other party, they're not as antagonistic or polarized as they are when they're thinking about leaders. Another thing that's out there is that quite often when you ask people, how do you feel about the Democrats? How do you feel about the Republicans? What people have in mind is a Democrat or a Republican who lives, breathes, and talks about politics 24 hours a day and has very strong opinions and wants to talk about them perpetually. People in general don't like folks who are constantly on when it comes to politics. It's just seen as aversive. So again, if you reassure people that the other Democrat or Republican that they're rating or evaluating is not one of those people who's going to come and start yelling at the Thanksgiving table, they have less polarized views. The whole point I'm trying to make with all of this is that people don't like a lot of people don't like conflict like this. And for that reason, they tend to not be highly involved in politics. And they can even withdraw from it even more when they do. So while I wouldn't say that we're at the level of trauma, it causes people to be cynical about politics. It causes themselves to distance themselves from politics. It can cause people even to, not identify with a party when they clearly agree with it. So, two researchers I know, Samara Klar and Yana Krupnikov, they studied independence about 7 years ago. And one thing you find is that there's a whole group of people who call themselves independents, but when you ask them whether they lean more toward one party or the other, a large number of them, well, yes, I'm independent, but I lean more to the Democrats. Yeah, I'm independent, but I lean more to the Republicans. If you look at the actual attitudes and beliefs and issue positions of those independent leaners, as we call them, they're indistinguishable from the people who will say, yep, I'm a Democrat. Yeah, I'm a Republican. So the question becomes, why won't they just call themselves that if that's what they are for all functional intents and purposes? Well, what we find is that those independent leaders don't like the idea of being partisan. It seems narrow-minded, cruel, cold, and conflict-oriented. So this kind of aversion won't necessarily lead people to be traumatized where we're at this point. And again, that's an all other things being equal statement. There are people in vulnerable groups who are going to feel that trauma much more. But on average, I wouldn't say we're there, but there are consequences to the intensity of political conflict. And I would say the big one is it just makes people cynical. It makes people withdraw. It makes people, not want to be too involved in politics or think much about it.
My concern is that I remember with the Civil War, there was bleeding Kansas. So
Yeah.
Americans had to be trained that it was okay to kill each other over the issue of slavery. And you had bleeding Kansas for 10 years. That traumatized the nation to the point that there was no walking back from the Civil War. It was like, we're going to this, we're doing that. They were not willing to shoot each other at first. They had to see it be done a lot. They had to see it be okay. They had to see it go on for almost 10 years. They had, as you mentioned, in Congress, someone beat someone down with a cane. So they're seeing this trauma, and it exacerbated their tensions to the point you get to Bull Run on both sides, where both sides said, no, you need to have a licking, meaning, I'm going to give it to you. So we can see where in American history you can have a period of traumatization without warfare, and most of the people that traumatizes the entire country to the point they can't come back from. The thing that got me on January 6th was that I'm a liberal. I had two different liberal friends who do not know each other at all. And on January 6th, I heard both of them say, why don't we line up 300 of those Republicans in front of the building and shoot them dead live on TV? I've never heard either of these people talk this way. They don't know each other. And both of them said this on the same day on January 6th, which leads me to believe many other people said that. I know that they've never had that thought before in their head, ever in their entire life. Why don't we gun down fellow Americans? But on January 6th, they had that. That thought never leaves. They're still there. My concern is, can you walk it down? Some of the issues that I'm looking at is this poll from the University of Virginia, Sabato Crystal Ball Center, 2021. 74% of Biden voters, 78% of Trump voters feel all voters from the other party are a clear and present danger to the USA. Clear and present danger is usually language for an ISIS terrorist attack. We can also look at the fact that schools, colleges are now being separated into red and blue. College students are doing that. We can also look at the fact that people are not marrying people outside of their own party in levels we haven't seen in a century. Or we can also look at the fact that a majority of Americans will now not date someone from outside the party. These are the people level. This is polarization at the level of the people. And I get the elites are making signals, but I don't remember Donald Trump ever saying, don't date anyone who's a Democrat. He said they're bad people, but obviously we can see the public taking this on. I'm just wondering, can we get to a point where you don't walk back from it? Like maybe you have 2 or 3 more January 6th before we're able to heal ourselves. Is there a point where people are just too traumatized and they go, I give up? I don't know what the answer is to that, but that's the concern I have.
It's hard to kind of give a clear answer to that question about, where that point is. I think in theory, there could be a point, at which, there's so much of an escalation of this. But, the other thing is that, the pendulum swings in the other direction too. Again, people don't like political conflict. And again, there are much more serious examples of this than, what we observe now. I mean, even in our own country, the late 1960s and early 1970s, by all objective indicators, involved far more political violence than we see now. We're kind of hyper exposed to it in news media, but there is that. But there are other examples. There's the troubles in Northern Ireland, the years of lead in Italy in the 70s, 80s. And one thing that you get when you look back at studies of those events is that people just get tired of it. It's disruptive, and eventually there's kind of a turn against the factors that enable it. And I think one question that's worth keeping an eye on for the next couple of years is obviously we're not like at the level of the Northern Irish Troubles or the years of lead in Italy, but January 6th was pretty shocking. And, it's sort of, for a lot of people, maybe a signal that things have gone too far. And, as a result, there have been a lot of prosecutions and there's a lot of public disapproval of it. So, one question is, Is there a shift back in the other direction? You can even look back at the 1990s as an example of this.
Right.
After Oklahoma City, there was kind of a ratcheting down of some of the rhetoric that had led up to that. And we're just going to have to see, I guess.
Good point. Good point. I don't know where it is either. I really appreciate you being willing to take questions and like, what about this? What about that? Because I don't know what to think. And I found the public is even less informed than me. Okay, last question. You're not you. You're not me. You're a third person you've never met. This person's watching this interview and they're going, wow, there was a lot of stuff. I learned a lot of stuff I didn't know. So great. But there was a lot of things, and I'm there and I'm struggling to remember all of it. But there was this one thing that the professor said, and boy, it's 5 days later, and I cannot forget this one thing the professor said. What is that one thing you want a random person you've never met to not be able to get out of their head about a week from now in the future?
Well, there are differences among human beings in our psychological makeup, in our personalities, and the groups we identify with, and the things we care about that potentially concede conflict. But the mere fact that there are differences among people in all those things doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to see polarization at a social or political level. A lot of that kind of depends on how political systems organize those differences, the extent to which they make those differences salient or less salient, and the extent to which they're able to allow people to process disagreements, to address grievances, to address injustices in a fashion that, well, doesn't make everyone sing Kumbaya or doesn't make everyone think exactly the same way, at least allows those concerns to be addressed in a way that keeps it from getting to the level of wrecking institutions, causing violence, and what have you.
I hope that you found this was a fair interview, not gotcha journalism. Do you have any recommendations? Is there anybody you know who might be willing to be part of an honest conversation?
Iftak Lelkis.
Okay.
I don't know if you.
I know who that is.
Yeah, I can't remember whether he was on the list of people that you've been looking at, but
I'm trying to get a hold of him still.
Yeah, he's a good one. Rob Willer at Stanford. I don't know if you've talked with him.
No.
Yeah, those are the two big ones that I can think of right now. I don't know if you've talked to Samara Klar, Klar.
I have tried to. I got her on the phone for about 5 minutes, and then she had to rush, so I'm going to keep following up.
Yana Krupnikov is another.
What about Michael Hessler?
Tesler. Yeah. So his name is Tesler.
Okay, Michael Tesler. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. And he studies differences in racial attitudes.
Okay. I really appreciate that. We're just trying to keep the conversation going. I want to say thank you for coming out. I will send you a copy of the video. I really appreciate your time, and I really, really, really appreciate you being willing to take on theoretical questions. Not everybody's willing to do that, but it's the only way the public understands. They don't have the same amount of knowledge base as the scientists and academics who are working on it. They kind of need it generalized a little bit to digest it, and I really appreciate you being willing to do that.
No problem. I think it was all fair.
Thank you. I will email you soon, and thank you very much for coming out, Professor.
No problem. Have a good day.
You too.